Arjun stared at his laptop screen, the blue light casting shadows across his tired face. It was almost midnight, and he was still working on the quarterly report that his boss needed by morning. In the bedroom down the hall, Mira lay awake, listening to the sound of keyboard clicks that had become the soundtrack of their marriage. She couldn't remember the last time they'd actually talked about something that mattered. 8 years ago, everything had been different. They used to stay up late talking about dreams and possibilities. Arjun would make her laugh with his terrible jokes, and she'd sketch little drawings of their future together. Now, those days felt like they belonged to different people entirely. Mira worked from home as a graphic designer, taking on projects for small businesses and startups. She loved the creative freedom. But lately, the house felt more like a prison than a workspace. She'd finish a project and want to share her excitement with Arjun, but he'd come home so exhausted that she didn't have the heart to burden him with her stories. Their mornings followed the same routine. Arjun would wake up, shower quickly, grab whatever breakfast Mira had prepared, and rush out the door with barely a goodbye. She'd watch him leave and feel a heaviness settle in her chest. When had they stopped kissing each other goodbye? When had good morning become just a mumbled word instead of a warm embrace? One Saturday afternoon, Mira was cleaning out the closet when she found a shoebox tucked away on the top shelf. Inside were photographs from their college days and early years of marriage. There was one of them at a street food stall, both laughing with sauce on their faces. Another showed them dancing at a friend's wedding, Arjun twirling her around with pure joy in his eyes. She sat on the bedroom floor, going through each photograph, and the tears started flowing before she could stop them. Where had these two people gone? The couple in these pictures looked so alive, so connected. Now, she and Arjun barely made eye contact during dinner. The sound of the front door opening made her quickly wipe her tears. Arjun walked into the bedroom, loosening his tie with one hand while checking his phone with the other. He looked up and froze when he saw her sitting on the floor surrounded by photographs, her eyes red from crying. For a moment, neither of them moved. Arjun wanted to go to her, to ask what was wrong, to hold her, and make everything better. But there was this invisible wall between them now, built brick by brick from all the missed moments and unspoken feelings. He felt like he was looking at his wife through glass, close enough to see her pain but unable to reach through and touch it. Mira looked at him standing there in his work clothes, phone still in hand, and felt a wave of loneliness wash over her. He was right there, just a few feet away, but he felt further than ever. She wanted to tell him how much she missed them, missed what they used to be, but the words stuck in her throat. Arjun cleared his throat awkwardly and asked if she was okay. His voice sounded strange, too formal, like he was talking to a colleague instead of his wife. Mira just nodded and started putting the photographs back in the box. She couldn't trust herself to speak without breaking down completely. He stood there for another minute, wanting to say something meaningful, something that would bridge this awful distance between them. But his mind was still half at the office, thinking about Monday's meetings and pending deadlines. The moment passed, and he quietly changed into comfortable clothes and left the room. That night, they lay in the same bed but might as well have been in different cities. Arjun stayed on his side, Mira on hers, with what felt like miles of empty space between them. She could hear him breathing, could feel the slight movement of the mattress when he shifted position, but he felt unreachable. Mira stared at the ceiling, wondering when they'd become strangers. They still shared a home, a bed, a life on paper. But somewhere along the way, they'd lost each other in the routine of just surviving each day. She thought about reaching across that space, placing her hand on his shoulder, starting a conversation that might save them. But fear held her back. What if he didn't respond? What if the distance was already too great to cross? Arjun lay awake too, feeling the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on his chest. He knew something was wrong. Had known for months now, but admitting it felt like opening a door he wasn't ready to walk through, so he kept his eyes closed and pretended to sleep, while the silence between them grew louder with each passing minute. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon while Mira was working on a logo design for a new client. Her father's voice was shaking, and she could barely understand his words through the panic. Her mother had collapsed at home and was being rushed to the hospital. The doctors suspected a heart attack. Mira's hands trembled as she threw clothes into a bag. Her hometown was 4 hours away by train. She called Arjun immediately, her voice breaking as she explained what had happened. He was in the middle of a meeting, but stepped out to take her call. She could hear voices in the background, someone asking when he'd be back. He promised he'd wrap things up at work and join her by tomorrow evening at the latest. There was an important presentation scheduled for the next morning, something he'd been preparing for weeks. Once that was done, he'd come straight to her. Mira wanted to ask him to come now, to drop everything and be with her. But she heard herself saying, "Okay," instead. The train journey felt endless. Mira kept checking her phone for updates from her father. Her mother was stable but needed more tests. The uncertainty was crushing. She looked around the train compartment at strangers living their normal lives and felt completely alone. When she reached the hospital, her father looked like he'd aged 10 years in one day. They sat together in the waiting area, holding hands, not saying much. The doctors came and went with updates. Her mother had suffered a mild heart attack and would need to stay in the hospital for observation. It could have been much worse, they said, but she'd need rest and careful monitoring. That first night, Mira slept in a chair next to her mother's hospital bed. Every beep of the monitor made her heart jump. She kept thinking Arjun would walk through the door any minute, but he didn't come. The next day, Arjun called to explain that the presentation had led to unexpected follow-up meetings. The investors had questions, and his boss needed him to handle the discussions. He sounded stressed and apologetic. Maybe he could come tomorrow instead? Mira said okay again, though the word tasted bitter in her mouth. Tomorrow came and went. Then the day after that. There was always something urgent at work. Always one more thing that needed his attention. Mira stopped waiting for him to show up. She spent her days at the hospital, talking to doctors, helping her mother eat, pretending everything was fine. Her mother was getting better, but recovery would take time. Mira decided to stay and take care of her for a couple of weeks. Her father worked long hours at his shop and couldn't manage alone. It made sense for her to stay, she told herself. During those quiet hospital nights, Mira's childhood friend Kavya started visiting. They'd known each other since school, and Kavya had always been the kind of friend who saw through pretense. One evening, as they sat in the hospital cafeteria over bad coffee, Kavya asked the question Mira had been avoiding. How were things really with Arjun? The floodgates opened. Mira found herself talking about the loneliness, the feeling of being forgotten, the way she'd become invisible in her own marriage. She told Kavya about lying awake at night next to someone who felt like a stranger, about eating dinner in silence, about celebrating their last anniversary with a store-bought cake and tired smiles. Kavya listened without judgment, but her concern was clear in her eyes. She asked gently if Mira had thought about what she really wanted from this marriage. The question hung in the air between them like something dangerous. Back at the house, Arjun was discovering what emptiness really felt like. He'd thought he understood loneliness, working late nights at the office. But this was different. Coming home to a dark, silent house was unbearable. He'd open the door expecting to smell whatever Mira had cooked for dinner, expecting to hear her voice asking about his day. Instead, there was nothing. Just his own footsteps echoing through empty rooms. He'd pick up his phone to call her a dozen times a day, then hesitate. What would he say? That he missed her? That he was sorry? The words felt inadequate for the distance that had grown between them, so he'd put the phone down and go back to work, trying to fill the void with spreadsheets and meetings. 2 weeks passed this way. Their phone conversations became shorter and more practical. How's your mother doing? Fine. How's work? Busy. Okay. Take care. You too. Click. Neither of them was saying what really needed to be said. The silence between them was no longer just physical distance. It had become something much more dangerous. The Friday evening Arjun finally arrived in Mira's hometown. The air was thick with unsaid things. He'd taken the afternoon off and driven 4 hours, practicing conversations in his head the whole way. But when he walked into her childhood home and saw her standing in the kitchen, all his rehearsed words disappeared. Mira looked different somehow. Thinner maybe. or just tired. But there was something else too. Something harder in her eyes. She greeted him with a small smile that didn't quite reach those eyes, and his stomach twisted with worry. Her mother was home now, recovering slowly but steadily. She hugged Arjun warmly when he visited her room, but he noticed how she watched them both. Her wise old eyes, missing nothing. The way Mira and Arjun moved around each other like careful strangers didn't escape her attention. Dinner that night was awkward. Mira's father tried to keep conversation going, asking Arjun about work and the city. Arjun answered on autopilot, while watching Mira push food around her plate. She barely looked at him. After dinner, Mira's mother asked Arjun to help her to the garden for some fresh air. Her husband offered, but she insisted she wanted Arjun. Once they were seated on the old wooden bench under the mango tree, she got straight to the point. She told him about the nights she'd woken up to hear Mira crying in the next room, about how her daughter had lost weight and stopped smiling the way she used to, about the sadness that had settled into Mira's eyes like something permanent. Her voice was gentle but firm as she asked him what had happened to the young man who used to look at her daughter like she was the sun itself. Arjun felt each word like a physical blow. He'd known things weren't good between them, but hearing it described this way made it real in a way he'd been avoiding. He tried to explain about work pressure and responsibilities, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Mira's mother placed her weathered hand on his and said something that would stay with him forever. She told him that her husband had worked hard his whole life too, providing for their family, but he'd never let work make him forget who he was working for. What good was building a life if you weren't present to live it? That night, Arjun couldn't sleep. He lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, her words playing on repeat in his mind. He thought about all the times he'd chosen work over Mira, all the dinners he'd missed, the conversations he'd cut short, the moments he'd been physically present but mentally somewhere else. The next morning, he tried to talk to Mira. They sat on the front porch while her parents rested inside. He started apologizing, trying to explain everything he'd realized. But Mira held up her hand, stopping him. Her voice was calm but sad as she spoke. She told him she'd spent the last 3 weeks thinking a lot about their marriage, about whether love was supposed to feel this lonely, about whether she could spend the rest of her life feeling invisible to the person who was supposed to see her most clearly. She wasn't asking for a divorce. Not exactly. But she needed time to figure out what she wanted, time to understand if they could fix what was broken or if they'd grown too far apart to find their way back. Arjun felt his heart drop into his stomach. The possibility of losing her, really losing her, suddenly became terrifyingly real. This wasn't just about them drifting apart anymore. This was about Mira questioning whether their marriage had a future at all. He wanted to argue, to promise he'd change, to beg her not to give up on them. But looking at her exhausted face, he realized his words had lost their value. He'd made promises before, implied commitments through his wedding vows, and then broken them all through neglect. The rest of the weekend passed in a blur. Arjun tried to be helpful, tried to show he cared, but everything felt forced and too late. Sunday evening, he had to drive back to the city for Monday morning meetings. As he packed his bag, the weight of what he was losing pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. Mira walked him to his car. They stood there in the fading light, and Arjun wanted to pull her close, to hold her, and never let go. But there was a distance between them that felt impossible to cross. He settled for a brief, awkward hug, and a promise to call her soon. As he drove away, watching her figure grow smaller in his rearview mirror, something cracked inside him. For the first time, he let himself feel the full weight of what his choices had cost. He pulled over 20 minutes down the road and broke down crying, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He'd built a successful career and a comfortable life, but somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten to build a marriage, and now, the person he loved most in the world was slipping through his fingers, and he had no idea how to hold on. Monday morning, Arjun walked into his boss's office and did something he'd never done in his 10-year career. He asked for a month off. His boss looked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. Arjun never took time off, not even his allotted vacation days. He was the guy who worked through holidays, and answered emails at midnight. But Arjun stood firm. He had personal matters that needed his immediate attention. His boss tried to negotiate, offering a week instead. Bringing up upcoming projects and client deadlines, Arjun just shook his head. A month, or he'd have to reconsider his priorities altogether. The shock on his boss's face would have been funny under different circumstances. But Arjun felt no humor, only a desperate clarity. He'd spent years building his career while his marriage crumbled. Now he had to make a choice. And for once, he was choosing Mira. 2 days later, Arjun was back in Mira's hometown. But this time he'd rented a small one-room apartment near her parents' house. When he showed up at their door with his suitcase, Mira's confusion was obvious. He explained his plan simply. He was staying. He wanted to help with her mother's care and prove that he could be the husband she deserved. Mira didn't know what to make of it. Part of her wanted to believe him. But another part, the part that had been hurt too many times, kept its guard up. She told him actions would matter more than words. And he nodded, accepting the challenge. The first week was strange for everyone. Arjun showed up every morning at 8, ready to help however needed. He learned to prepare the special low-salt meals her mother required. He drove her to follow-up doctor appointments. He helped her father at the shop during busy afternoon hours. He did dishes, swept floors, ran errands. Mira watched all of this with cautious eyes. She wanted to trust it, but she kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for his laptop to come out, for work calls to take over, for him to announce he had to go back early. But days passed, and Arjun stayed present. He'd left his laptop in the city, bringing only his phone, which he kept on silent, except for emergencies. When work calls came, he'd step outside and keep them brief. His colleagues and boss were confused by this new version of Arjun, but he didn't care anymore. Slowly, carefully, he and Mira started talking again. Real talking, not the surface-level exchanges they'd fallen into. At first, it was practical stuff about her mother's medication schedule or grocery shopping. But gradually, deeper conversations emerged. One evening, they took a walk through the neighborhood where Mira had grown up. She showed him the school she'd attended, the park where she used to play, the corner shop where she'd bought candy as a child. Arjun realized how little he knew about this part of her life. They'd been so focused on building their future together that he'd never really explored her past. As they walked, Mira started opening up about how lonely she'd felt. Not just recently, but for years. She described coming home excited to share news about a new client, only to have him barely look up from his computer. She talked about birthdays where he'd been too busy to celebrate properly, about the time she'd had a health scare and went to the doctor alone because he had an important meeting. Arjun listened, really listened, and each story was like a knife to his heart. He'd been there for all of these moments, but he hadn't been present. He'd been a ghost haunting his own life, missing everything that truly mattered. He shared his own struggles too, though they felt inadequate as explanations. The pressure he'd felt to provide, to prove himself, to climb the corporate ladder, how he'd convinced himself that working harder meant loving better, that financial security was the same as emotional support. He'd been so wrong about everything. The breakthrough came during an unexpected moment. Mira's mother had a small setback, nothing serious but scary enough to require an emergency doctor visit at midnight. Arjun drove them to the hospital, stayed calm while Mira panicked, handled all the paperwork and discussions with doctors. He held Mira's hand in the waiting room and didn't let go. When they got home at dawn, exhausted and relieved, Mira finally let herself lean against him. She was so tired of holding everything together alone, and Arjun was there, solid and present, his arms around her as the sun came up. Something shifted between them in that moment. Not fixed, not healed completely, but shifted. A crack in the wall that had been separating them. The following days brought more of these small moments. Arjun making her coffee the way she liked it without being asked. Mira laughing at one of his terrible jokes for the first time in months, their hands brushing while cooking together and not pulling away. Sitting on the porch in comfortable silence instead of the heavy, awkward quiet that had defined them before. 3 weeks into his stay, they had their most honest conversation yet. It was raining hard, and they were stuck inside while her parents napped. Arjun finally admitted how scared he was of losing her. How the thought of going back to their old life filled him with dread. How he'd rather start over from scratch than go back to being strangers who shared a bed. Mira admitted she'd been scared too. Scared that nothing would change, scared that it was too late. Scared of hoping and being disappointed again, but also scared of giving up on something that had once been so beautiful. They cried together that afternoon, mourning the years they'd wasted and the pain they'd caused each other. But there was also relief in finally being honest, in laying all their broken pieces on the table and examining them together instead of hiding them away. As the month neared its end, neither of them wanted to think about going back to the city. But Mira's mother was doing much better, and real life was waiting for them. The question was whether they could take these changes back with them or if they'd fall into old patterns once they returned to their normal environment. The decision to return to the city together came naturally, without much discussion needed. Mira's mother was strong enough to manage with just her father's help, and it was time for them to face their real life. But this time, something fundamental had changed between them. The drive back was different from all those lonely journeys before. Arjun and Mira talked the whole way, making plans, setting boundaries, dreaming about what their marriage could become. They agreed on weekly date nights, no exceptions, daily check-ins where they'd share their feelings honestly. No work emails after 8 in the evening. These rules felt simple, but they represented a complete shift in priorities. Walking back into their home felt strange at first. The same furniture, the same walls, but they weren't the same people who'd left weeks ago. Arjun looked around and saw all the places where he'd failed to show up. The dining table where they'd eaten so many silent dinners. The bedroom where they'd slept back to back for months. The couch where he'd spent countless evenings with his laptop instead of his wife. But instead of letting those memories weigh them down, they decided to reclaim their space. They rearranged furniture together. Mira put up new artwork. Arjun set up a proper workspace in the spare room, so he wouldn't bring his laptop to bed anymore. Small changes, but they mattered. The real test came when Arjun returned to work. His colleagues were surprised by the changes in him. He left the office at 6 every evening, no matter what. He stopped checking emails during dinner. He said no to projects that would require excessive overtime. Some people thought he'd lost his ambition. His boss had a serious talk with him about career trajectory, but Arjun didn't care about any of that anymore. He'd learned the hard way that success at work meant nothing if you failed at life. He was good at his job. He delivered quality work. But he refused to sacrifice his marriage on the altar of corporate achievement ever again. The weekly date nights became sacred. Sometimes they went to fancy restaurants. Sometimes they cooked together at home. Sometimes they just took long walks in the park. The activity didn't matter. What mattered was the time, the attention, the choice to prioritize each other. They also started going to couples counseling, something Arjun had initially been resistant to. But the sessions helped them communicate better, understand each other's needs, and work through years of accumulated hurt. It wasn't easy or comfortable, but it was necessary. 3 months into this new chapter, their 9th anniversary arrived. Neither of them wanted a repeat of last year's half-hearted celebration. Instead, Arjun had planned something special. He'd been secretive about it, only telling Mira to pack a bag for the weekend. He drove them to the coast, to the same beach where he'd proposed 9 years earlier. Mira's eyes widened with recognition as they pulled up. They'd talked about coming back here but never had the time. Now here they were, walking along the same stretch of sand where their forever had begun. They spent the day together, just being present with each other, swimming in the ocean, eating fresh seafood at a small shack, watching kids build sandcastles, simple pleasures they'd forgotten to enjoy. As the sun began setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they stood at the water's edge. Mira turned to Arjun, and something vulnerable crossed her face. She told him how close she'd come to giving up on them, how there were nights in her hometown when she'd convinced herself that divorce might be kinder than this slow death of their love. How terrified she'd been that they'd lost each other forever. The words hit Arjun like a physical force. He'd known things had been bad, but hearing how close he'd come to losing her completely made his blood run cold. The thought of a life without Mira, of waking up alone, of growing old without her, was unbearable. Without thinking, purely on instinct, he pulled her into his arms. But this wasn't a casual hug or a polite embrace. His arms wrapped around her with desperate intensity, holding her so tightly she gasped slightly. One hand pressed against the small of her back, the other cradled her head against his chest, his whole body curved around hers protectively, like he could shield her from every hurt, including the ones he'd caused. Mira felt his heart pounding against her cheek. She felt the slight tremor in his hands, the way his breathing had gone unsteady. This wasn't just an embrace. This was a man holding on to everything that mattered, terrified to let go, even for a second. Arjun's face was buried in her hair, and she felt something wet against her scalp. He was crying, she realized. Not loudly, but tears were falling nonetheless. His voice came out rough and broken as he whispered that he loved her, that he was so sorry, that the thought of losing her was his worst nightmare. The sun continued setting around them, but they stood frozen in that moment. Mira's own tears started flowing, soaking into his shirt. She wrapped her arms around him too, holding him back just as tightly. All the pain, all the loneliness, all the fear of these past months poured out between them. People walked past on the beach, giving them space, sensing this was something private and profound. Minutes passed. Maybe longer. Neither of them wanted to be the first to let go. When they finally pulled back enough to look at each other, both their faces were tear-stained and red, but there was something else there too. Relief. Hope, a renewed commitment that went deeper than their wedding vows. Mira touched his face gently, wiping away his tears with her thumbs. She told him she wasn't going anywhere, that they'd fought too hard to get here to give up now, that he was stuck with her for life, and she with him. Arjun kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. It felt like their first kiss all over again, like starting fresh while carrying the wisdom of all they'd survived. As they walked back to their hotel, hand in hand, the stars coming out above them, Mira understood something profound. Love wasn't just about the butterflies and passion of the beginning, it was about this too. About fighting for each other when things got hard, about choosing each other every single day, about holding on tight when the world tried to pull you apart. Arjun looked at her in the moonlight and felt gratitude wash over him. He'd almost lost his entire world through his own stupidity and neglect. But somehow, miraculously, he'd been given a second chance, and he was never, ever, taking it for granted again. Their marriage wasn't perfect now. They still had arguments, still faced challenges, still had to work at it every day. But they were in it together. Really together. For the first time in years, and that made all the difference.